Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtually Speaking Podcast, episode number 206. My name is Pete Fletcher, aka Pedro Arrow, and joining me as always is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, man?
Good. It's rodeo season here.
It sure is, man. How was the rodeo?
It's we just had barbecue kickoff, it was a lot of good things, but also a lot of cold weather. So you see I've got my hat on here. But I also have my Barcelona scarf because I was looking for anything warm for when I was going to stand out there for 8 hours in the freezing cold. So.
Wait, it was cold in Texas? I thought it was always hot in Texas.
I mean, when I say cold, I mean 39 degrees or something in rain.
So tell me, what do you do in a rodeo? Do you actually do you do anything with horses, or is it just really an excuse to drink beer and eat barbecue?
So, I mean, there are horses. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. I mean, you got a petting zoo for the kids, and you got mutton busting for the kiddos. You got concerts. All the big names will be there. So, big names for maybe us, maybe not Pete and his advanced music career, but no, cook-off's about barbecue. It's about getting people together, and people from all walks of life. Like, I mean, the people I was hanging out with, you'd expect, okay, you got your rodeo folk and your people, kind of from an ag background. But, I was, talking about cloud services or file services in the cloud with some guys at Amazon at the gate, and, talking to another guy about a tech incubator. So it brings together people and from different areas that you might not expect coming together.
Nice.
And that's, kind of a good analogy, I feel like, in a way, for what the tech industry is doing, is that, you may have different tribes or different groups, but at the end of the day, they often get brought together by customers or customer needs. Or in our case, the need for some people to stand in front of a gate and, make sure everything gets held up.
So you were the gatekeeper. I like it.
Yeah.
Well, John, listen, that was awesome. I'm glad for the update. I love you in your hat and your scarf. You're looking super rugged yet bougie at the same time. But this
rugged
is not
yet bougie. That's going to be my new motto in life.
Absolutely. But yeah, John, I wanted to talk to you. One of the things that we had internally recently was a discussion with some SQL experts about clustering Microsoft SQL, but on Linux, and that's something that came out a few years ago. And that's kind of a curious thing to me. I've always been curious as to, how does that work? Why would somebody do that? And so we had a pretty interesting conversation internally with some folks, and I thought, this actually would be good for the Virtually Speaking Podcast. And so we're going to bring these guys on and see if we can pick their brains yet again, starting with one of our resident SQL experts at VMware, Deji Akomolafe. Deji, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, guys. Good afternoon. Hey, John.
Hey, thanks for taking some time to chat with us again.
My pleasure.
Awesome. And joining the discussion as well is our good friend, Mr. Charles Lee. Charles, welcome to the podcast. Charles, are you muted?
Yes, I was muted. Apologies. Yes, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Unmuted as well.
Yeah. Yeah, you sound better now. Awesome. So yeah, I wanted to have this discussion with you guys because I definitely have questions, and I want to know how this is done and what VMware customers can look forward to and what they should consider. But before we get into the how, let's talk a little bit about the why. Deji, maybe you can set the level for us. Like, what exactly is Microsoft up to when they start pushing SQL Server, clustered SQL Server on Linux? What's that about?
Isn't that a good question? So, Pete and John, you guys know what I do at VMware. For the audience, I work in the workloads team, the business critical applications team, and I focus primarily on Microsoft applications. Microsoft mission critical application like SQL Server. SQL Server happens to be the #1 application virtualized on the vSphere platform. It's been my bread and butter since I've been at VMware. It's always been Windows. I'm a Windows guy. When you hear Microsoft, you think Windows. A few years ago, well, longer than a few now, but sometimes ago, Microsoft pivot, started looking more closely at the Linux world, started contributing, started innovating, and well, long story short, about 3-4 years ago, or maybe 5 now, Microsoft said, okay, how much can we disrupt our customer base and administrators' life? Why don't we take SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server, and run it on Linux? Well, again, Microsoft has been evolving, and it is logical that applications like Microsoft SQL Server will be one of the things they innovate on. Also, remember, Kubernetes, containers, Dockers, and all of these things were getting a lot of traction in the market. I don't want to speak for Microsoft, but they saw an opportunity there, and having one of the most popular databases out there, enterprise level databases out there, it makes sense that they will want to also play in that developer world, in the container world, in the Kubernetes world. I would say this is why this happened. 2017, Microsoft released the first edition of Microsoft SQL Server on Linux, and that's why we're here. It upended a lot of traditional thinking. It upended a lot of administrators' life. I speak for myself. I've been doing Microsoft SQL Server for decades. I don't touch Linux. Now, there is Microsoft SQL Server on Linux, and the traction has been exponential. A lot of people are looking at it. Our customers are looking at it, and they are coming to us and saying, okay, how do we do this thing on
Nice.
vSphere? That's why we're here.
Nice. Well, so I guess and we don't have to rip apart the entire architecture, but coming from a Windows background myself, I was a consultant for many years, and I was an Exchange administrator. I've done many migrations, and I'm very familiar with SQL, very familiar with the Active Directory, and I know that they are they're very closely related. Anything related to Exchange or SQL, even clustering depends on Active Directory. It's sort of the brain, if you will, for all, business critical applications for Microsoft. So how do you push this on Linux? Not the long architected version, but how does that actually work for, I guess I'm missing a part.
And again, a very fair question, but Pete, don't forget, we've always been able to integrate Linux into Active Directory for a long time, but Microsoft went beyond that. For the ease of administration, installation, configuration, and usage, they actually made Active Directory not essential for running SQL Server on Linux. Yes, you have Samba. Yes, you have other these plugins where you can authenticate to Microsoft applications or authenticate from a Linux machine and application to AD. For this thing we're talking about, that is not even in consideration. So you can essentially run Microsoft SQL Server on Linux without even thinking about Active Directory. If you want to get fancy and you want to get plug it into Active Directory, that's your choice. But for operational purposes, you don't need it.
Interesting. All right. Well, I know that there's some other pieces to this that are important that make it work, and I want to lean on Charles a little bit for this because I know, Charles, you had a lot to do with the configuration of this this application that will essentially deploy SQL Server on Linux for a VMware environment. So, Charles, maybe you can set some of the groundwork for me about what this application is and what are some of the components that actually make it work.
Right, absolutely. So kind of what we did when you kind of like Deji was alluding to, like Microsoft SQL on Linux, basically what it's done is it's taken a product that people are very familiar with in an environment, Windows, that people are very familiar with, and basically dropped them in the middle of a completely new ecosystem, which is Linux. And that brings about certain challenges. A lot of these administrators lack familiarity with Linux, how it operates, the tool set. I mean, most people are even unfamiliar or are not entirely comfortable with command line interface. So what we've done, and this is kind of what I do. So within the team, I wear multiple hats. One of the hats, obviously, is dealing with business critical applications, but I also do a lot of automation. So what we've always kind of been doing in the background is automating a lot of this stuff for our own consumption, right? If you're going to do something more than 2-3 times, why not automate it, right? So then it's easier to do, and then it's easier to disseminate with other people. And this is kind of what we did with this. We've taken it one step further. So what we've done is we've basically taken both Terraform and Ansible, and we've used that to create all the orchestration required to basically deploy the infrastructure. So create the VMs, create the resource pool, create the anti-affinity rules, basically deploy the Microsoft SQL VMs according to our best practices and Microsoft best practices. And then we've also written all of the automation using Ansible to basically deploy and configure. So do all of the internal configuration inside of the VM. So installing Microsoft SQL, setting up Pacemaker, setting up the fencing, uh, creating the accounts, all of that goodness. We basically do everything. And we've then taken that and we packaged it. We provide this to people in two different formats. So the first one is if you're more hands-on, we have a GitHub page where you can go and download the source code for both the Terraform and the Ansible components. And that makes it easier if you want to integrate that into your own production framework or whatever it is that you have. It's really the foundation of it. But for people that are maybe less familiar with that or don't have a framework yet, we've also created an OVA, so basically a VM, where we've put everything in it and we disseminate that also. So users that just want sort of like the automatic fly-by-wire sort of experience can download an OVA, do some minimal configuration of two files. So basically, what is your vCenter? What is your username? What is your password? What data center do you want this in? Details like that. And then basically deploy. And 30 minutes later, if you go into your data center, you'll see you have a Microsoft SQL cluster all up and running, fully configured according to best practices. So the clustering is done. We use Pacemaker. We have Stoneit, the fencing set up. So a lot of the really gritty details are all taken care of and ready to consume.
Well, you can't just say all the details are taken care of and not expect me to drill into that. What are the details? So first off, for clustering, my vague memory of Microsoft SQL clustering, which I've tried to purge from my thoughts, but you have always on availability groups, which is kind of a scale out style cluster. You make a full second copy, which is the more modern. If there's any corruption or issues, you've got a clean failover copy. Then you've got what I like to call, but some SQL aficionados will get angry at me, I guess, FCI, or previously known as MSCS. That's the legacy clustering that operates off of shared storage, be that shared iSCSI, SMB, or apparently NFS, as I'm reading the Microsoft documents. So it looks like you guys, which one did you guys choose and kind of why?
That's a very good question. And by the way, John, don't come for my job. Sorry. So, yeah, traditionally, before 2017, when there was nothing Linux, Microsoft has clustering, Windows Server failover clustering, which we used to call MSCS, Microsoft Clustering Service, up to 2008. Starting with SQL 2012, the name changed and the branding changed. You have what they call Always On, the marketing name for clustering SQL Server. And behind that, you have FCI, failover clustering instance, and you have availability group. For us, for any customer running on vSphere, running SQL Server on vSphere, we don't care what those names are. Two things are important. One is that the FCI, the failover clustering instance, which John calls legacy. Sorry, that's some fighting words there. So the FCI.
Okay, we'll agree CCR is legacy. CCR is legacy.
Okay. Now you're talking a change to me. All right. Yeah. Pete, we'll get him. But anyway, so for the FCI, the only thing you need to know about it on the vSphere platform is that all the nodes participating in that cluster share the same disk, shared disk for the transaction log, TMDB, except for the OS volumes. When you want to do that on vSphere, up to a certain version of vSphere, we'll ask you to go use what we call raw device mapping, but we won't get into that for the purpose of this discussion. Then there is the availability group. The availability group gives you a configuration where the nodes don't share anything. They don't share the storage. They don't. They are all independent nodes, all just clustered and riding on Windows Server failover clustering. The common thing is whichever of these you use, you still have WSFC Windows Server failover clustering behind the scene. Okay. On vSphere, again, you can do either. That was before 2017. In 2017, when Microsoft came up with a SQL Server on Linux, that changed because WSFC, Windows Server Failover Clustering, is really the orchestrated brain behind the clustering aspect of it, and it wasn't easily portable to Linux. So Microsoft looked out there and said, okay, what's out there? How do people do clustering on Linux? Of course, you have Pacemaker, you have CoroSync, and then you have what you call shoot the other node in the head, Stoneth, which just simply says, if you can't reach the other node in this cluster, just knock it. Assume that it's dead. Okay. For that piece, you will rely on the platform that you are using to create the fencing. So there is a fencing agent depending on on Red Hat, on IBM, on whatever you're using. On vSphere, VMware has the VMware fencing agent. There are two versions of it where we'll get into that. So these components, these external dependencies or components replace the orchestration provided by WSFC in the Windows world.
Okay.
This is how we are able to achieve clustering and high availability for Microsoft SQL Server on Linux in the Linux world.
Okay.
Okay, so no shared LUN required. No shared disk or shared SMB share.
For AG, for availability group.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah. First comment is I can't believe it's 2022 and we still have something called shoot the node in the head. So that's one observation. But
hey, dang, I'm already here to shoot things. We need to shoot some servers. All right,
you know what?
I got the hat for it.
Microsoft actually called that out in their documentation. They're like, okay, this is what's called today. It's not us. So they kind of watched it. We do. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying all the Linux people who maintain this are cowboys, but they're probably cowboys. Charles, I guess a question for you is on Pacemaker. I vaguely remember that as some type of cluster management solution. What's the relationship between Pacemaker and CoreSync? What do those subcomponents do at a vague level?
So the way it operates, Pacemaker is what you use to create the resources, to create the groups, to basically manage it. And CoreSync it is what handles the communication in the back end. So are the nodes able to communicate with one another? What's going on in the node? Oh, this guy is not responding. You need to take certain actions. So CoreSync is the one that does.
Yeah.
Okay.
So from a quorum basis, when we say node as a VMware admin, I normally think I think of a host, an actual vSphere host. Are we? And historically, going back to Stoneth, I remember with bare metal Red Hat, you would typically talk to an out of band like an ILO or an iDRAC or a CIMC and actually physically power off a host. What is it we're communicating with? What is the customer's endpoints they're communicating with? How are they communicating with, and what are they powering off?
Absolutely. That's an excellent question, John. And exactly right. So we tend to reuse the same terms very often, node, node, node. But what exactly are we talking about? So in the context of Microsoft SQL, when we talk about a node or Pacemaker, we're talking about the actual VM running on vSphere. So when we say, okay, Stoneth is going to shoot the node in the head, what it's talking about is it's talking about killing the VM. And that's really what we do. What we're doing as part of our automation is setting up basically the automation Pacemaker to say, well, hey, This here is vSphere. This is the guy managing those nodes, the VMs, and this is what you're going to operate on. So if you need to like kill a node or you need to get the status, this is the guy where you get the information from or where you do your operations. So when we kill a node, we're not killing the ESX host. That would be catastrophic. What we're doing is we're killing the VM.
Are we talking to the virtual machine directly? Are we yelling at the host to shut that down? Is that vCenter? What's the?
It's communicating with vCenter.
Okay.
So when we're setting up the fencing is between the fence agent and vCenter. So
Okay.
Okay, let's so John, you have the ESXi host in the vSphere cluster, and then you have a number of VMs in which you've installed SQL Server, and you cluster them together as SQL Server cluster. So we have two different distinct cluster here, and the clustering, the pacemaker, the Caro Sync leverage the API, the VMware fencing agent API, to talk to the VMs inside vCenter. We want to do this. We want to shut you down. We want to halt you, whatever. The API is exposed, and that's what we communicate. That's what pacemaker, Coro Sync, and these Microsoft clustering thing communicates through to talk to the VMs, get their status, get their health, and then take whatever action it deems necessary as based on your configuration.
Okay.
So is this an active passive configuration by default? Is one of these only acknowledging writes initially and then you do a failover?
Okay, so that's another valid question. You will hear things like active configuration when people talk about SQL Server or even Exchange Server. There really isn't any such thing. It's one node is always the primary or active. Transaction is happening only on one. Depending on the configuration you choose, if you have what you call, so okay, let me back up a little bit. You have a cluster of SQL Server. Let's say you have 3 nodes, 3 VMs. Okay, for a particular database, okay, one of those VMs will be the one that has the active copy of that database. Now, it's possible that you have multiple databases, and a subset of those databases are active on one and active on the other and active on the other, right?
It sounds like virtual machines running inside of hosts, but at a whole nother level of abstraction. Like this is,
yes,
you
yes.
basically have the databases are effectual like virtual machines getting vMotioned or HA'd around.
Exactly.
Availability all the way down.
Yes, for the appliance, the automation that we're talking about here, choosing the AG option, the availability group option, that was a conscious decision because AG is what actually gives you the most protection because it doesn't share anything.
Yep.
With FCI, you have a single point of failure, which is the shared disk. If that shared disk is not available, none of the nodes can do anything. So this is why Microsoft invented or ported what used to be DAG from Exchange into SQL, and now we have availability group where nothing is shared. So this is why in our implementation and what we are releasing to the public, we've chosen to do the availability group option to maximize availability. So when anything happens to a VM or a database inside a VM that's clustered, that database fails over to another node in that cluster. Okay, it's just like your HA, vSphere HA host is not available. We power on the VM on another host. It's the same thing with this database and this configuration. I hope that is a little bit clearer.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think we've probably gone deeper into clustering than I originally intended, but hopefully we all learned a little bit about SQL along the way. So from a use case basis, I think back to some of the greatest availability challenges I ever had as an architect would be, I'm going to build this highly resilient, VDI that's N+4 cluster. and then it's like, oh, the Composer service needs a SQL server, and no one wants to deploy a SQL cluster.
Yeah.
I think I had similar challenges with VRA before they migrated databases. It looks like this makes clustering easy, where before typically I would just say, ugh, I'm going to accept 2 nines and move on with life, then try to configure a SQL cluster. Is this kind of a drop-in for those types of use cases?
Yes, definitely. One of the things I tell customers, and which my account people really don't like me saying, is that on the vSphere platform, when you're from application resiliency perspective, especially in the Microsoft world, I used to talk Windows and now Linux for what we're talking about. We don't actually have a replacement for Microsoft or the application native clustering capabilities. We have HA, we have DRS, but they don't do application level availability.
Yeah.
So most enterprise customers who virtualize a SQL Server don't run their mission critical application SQL Server without clustering
Sure.
ever. So this solution gives them the comfort level that we can do this in Linux, and we can still have HA and all the goodies and
Yeah.
the availability that we desire.
Very nice.
Well, and I like that there's no RDMs, because that was 90% of my grimacing and hatred of setting up a
Hey,
SQL cluster.
John, there's no
RDMs.
RDM anywhere. There's no RDM any. Forget RDM. Even in Windows World now, we don't do RDM. So 7.0, you have
As a
clustered
vSphere,
VMDK.
Yeah. So what about from a VMware perspective? Like, does this get deployed on any data store, vSAN, NFS, all that? And second part of the question, can we deploy this more than on premises? Is this something that's available, for cloud services, Amazon, Azure, any of those?
Very, very good question. Let me a little bit of a background on why we're even doing this at all. We've talked about clustering, we've talked about fencing, we've talked about pacemaker and blah blah, and then we've talked about Linux and all that. This came about because yes, customers are looking at it, and yes, Microsoft is putting a lot of innovation into SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server on Linux. For example, it's the only one they are putting effort into supporting container. Okay, so you are not going to get containers in SQL Server on Windows. So it is important that customers begin to look at it. And once our customers started looking at it, they started looking out for documentation, for instructions. How do we do this? Most of the documentation out there are incomplete and mostly outdated. We talked about stonings and fencing. Most of the documentation out there just skip that entirely because So when I came to Charles and Mark, our colleague Mark Chu, I like, okay, I've been doing this now for trying to get this operational and see what I can release out there for over a year. I don't want to repeat or regurgitate this documentation. What if you just create something that make this easier in a repeatable fashion for customers to be able to just plug it in, do it, and go. What Charles and Mark came up with, it cuts across all vSphere platform. It's vSphere, and whether it's on premises or whether it's in the cloud, as long as it writes on vSphere, our solution, this package works across the board. I will let Charles talk more about that.
Yep. No, I mean that's exactly spot on. We're pretty agnostic in terms of the infrastructure. If it's a vSphere API, we'll talk to it. If it's storage or a port group, that's all we really care about. How that's actually actualized under the hood, honestly, we don't really care. So we've been successful in deploying this, of course, on vSAN. We've done this on local storage. We've tried with NFS. The caveat there is you have to have a sufficient level of performance. So we had attempted on a very poorly performing NFS with predictable results, but in theory, anything as long as it's storage, compute, and networking, and it's a vSphere endpoint, that should be enough to be able to deploy this, right? And
And
Yep.
vSphere, how far back are we talking for support? Not support, but in general, how far have you tested?
How far have we dared to test? I can give you a very specific number.
Okay.
vSphere 6.7 U3 or 6.7 U3 42000. And the reason why is that specific build had some enhancements in terms of supporting the Ubuntu Linux. Prior to that, customization would not always work as expected. So we are using an Ubuntu VM for the Microsoft SQL nodes. So we discovered very quickly that if we went too far back, like 6.7 U2, it wouldn't customize properly, and then we would run into problems. So that's kind of where we put the line in the sand, and we've documented that also. So on the GitHub repository or in the notes, it kind of points, well, this is kind of your viable starting point, which is reasonable.
Yeah, sure.
Wait, you did regression testing on a GitHub project? What is that?
Well, Deji is really, Deji is fantastic at like pushing things to the limit, right? So we did this and we tested this on vSphere 7.0 going up to 7 U3. But Deji was testing this on 6.7 U1 and he's running into problems, testing on NFS. So we were able to test this on a good cross section of what's out there, for our customers.
Because everybody puts SQL on NFS, right?
Of course.
Officially no, but yes. John, we did do regression tests on GitHub because our goal is when we put this out there and our customers go and grab it and trust our word and try to use it, we want them to have the confidence that it will work and it will work to their satisfaction. So yes, we did break a lot of glass to get this out there.
Nice. Well, yeah. So I don't want to take too much time. It seems like a pretty straightforward solution, and I'm going to leave links on the show notes page to the GitHub. I know Deji, you wrote a really lengthy blog on this that was really helpful. But what if somebody wants to get started on this? Aside from the GitHub, is that the only place to go to get this, or how do people get their hands on this?
So the blog article that Deji wrote is a really good description of what it is, what it does, the why, and all of that sort of information. And he links to the GitHub page that we have. On that GitHub page, that's where you have both flavors. So source code, I want to kind of do this myself, and I like to follow instructions. Or we also have a download link to the OVA with instructions on how to use that as well. So for now, everything is hosted on the GitHub page. And as we're because this for us is really kind of a grassroots project. We started from, hey, let's try this and let's try, and as we're evolving, we're polishing it off and making it better. So for now, the starting point is really our GitHub page.
Okay.
I guess my last question is, where do you see driving a lot of the adoption? When I see Linux and the tooling that you're talking about, I just think to continuous integration, continuous test, kind of the DevOps type stuff. Is that where you're seeing the Linux on SQL? Is it people who are just too cheap to buy a Windows license? Where are you seeing the customer interest in this adoption? Is this people who are just Linux or die, or what? Who's consuming this?
Good question, John. Since we all work for the same company, you know this as much as I do. We do what our customers want. We give them what makes them successful. We meet them where they are. And for the past 5-6 years, Microsoft has been pushing the limits in what they do in the Linux world, in the enterprises. Our customers are becoming aware. I mentioned earlier that Microsoft flat out last year just said, "Oh, container in Windows on SQL on Windows, not doing." They just yanked it. They discontinued it. Containers on Microsoft on Linux on Microsoft SQL. You want that? You have to go get Microsoft SQL Server on Linux.
Yeah.
And that is what our customers have been saying. And we want them, being the #1 platform where you have virtualized SQL Server Microsoft SQL Server out there today. We want them to be comfortable, to be successful in doing whatever it is that they deem necessary to make their business successful. This is why we are doing this. Whatever they use it for, however they use it, we just want to meet them there and make sure that they're able to do it. That is the whole essence of this package.
I like it. Well said.
Like it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, there's a need for it. So, there's a lot of shops out there that are Linux shops, and I think, the big questions that most folks would have had, and I've seen this discussed in other blogs as well as yours, is if in fact I choose Linux, are there limitations to doing SQL Server on Linux? And I know there's versions, and there's anything that you deploy needs a little bit of due diligence and studying. But it seems like overall, with the help of these other software components, Stoneth and what have you, it seems as though we've got this clustering piece and failover piece, high availability piece that complements the Linux environments to make SQL actually happen on Linux. So it seems like a viable solution. And I love the fact that VMware customers now, instead of having to figure this out themselves, can just go and actually get a really good starting point. Of course, put it out there, run it, deploy it, and then maybe start to validate it and test it so you can get it into production. So I think this is a fantastic, really, really good starting point for customers interested in SQL on Linux. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining this episode of Virtually Speaking. Any closing thoughts before we land this plane?
Yeah, John, Pete, thank you for doing this. Last words from me. Charles mentioned the fact that all you need to do if you get the OVA is just plug into information into 2 files and you're done. All we need to know is what you want us to do, how many nodes you want, what the IP addresses are, and all that. As to limitations, we really don't have any. Every one of our best practices document for Microsoft applications mirror whatever Microsoft supports, and because we want to put the customer in compliance with the application vendors. We have for the SQL Server, for the AG, there is no limitation on the number. We defaulted to 3, and we can go whatever is supported by Microsoft officially for SQL on Linux. And our recommendation or the plea, what I'm trying to get out there as a message is, please go take a look at this. You do not need to plod through humongous pages of documentation anymore. This is very concise. This gives you a very repeatable, easy, reusable deployment platform where you can stand up Microsoft SQL on Linux cluster in under 30 minutes, however many nodes you want. And please do give us your feedback. We are polishing the deployment. The next iteration of this will be much more improved than what's out there today. But this works, and it works well. So please give it a try and give us your feedback.
Yeah. I mean, if ever you wanted to see what this is supposed to look like in production, or how this should even look, which is half the battle, right? If it's the first time that you're tackling this and you've never deployed SQL on Linux, it's confusing, right? What am I looking for? What does good look like? And this gives people a tool. So you can deploy it, you can look at it, you can touch it, you can see what are the results of the commands, and that gives you confidence. Okay, this is what this should look like in production or in my environment. So if you want to use that, or if you want to create your own automation, at least you have a blueprint of what the cake looks like. If you want to tweak the recipe, then you're good to go, because at least you know what a cake looks like.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
I like it. All right, gentlemen, that music tells me it's time to go. So if you want to get in touch with us, send us an email at podcast@vmware.com. You can subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice by searching Virtually Speaking Podcast. You can catch this in all episodes at vspeakingpodcast.com. A big thanks to Charles and Deji for joining us this week. We're back next week, but until then, bye for now. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining. That was fun.
Third time's the charm.